This video will now look directly at periodization and answering three main questions. So what you need to do is you need to click on the next section called periodization, and you'll see that the three questions have come up here. So really we want to know what periodization is in general, why we would use periodization, and pretty much what it looks like and what the structure is. So the next couple of slides, 3 or 4 slides of this video, will aim to answer those questions. However, if you do need additional help with understanding why we do it and what it is and what the structure is, then of course you can click on this link over here. And this is a website that briefly explains what periodization is, and is actually quite a general read. In addition, you also have again page 169 in your textbooks, which you should have with you. If you don't have them, then at least the electronic version of the textbook. And so from page 169 for a couple of pages really does set out what periodization is. With that, we're going to move into what it looks like and why we use it and what the structure is. So what is periodization? Well, basically periodization is just planning. Is an annual plan of training, is not being able to go to the gym without an aim or without planning that are related to certain components or certain parts of the season. Now, that sounds very simple, and to be honest, it pretty much is. But the reason why we do this is because we have known that athletes, when we train them, they need to peak at certain periods of their season. So for a football player, they would need to be peaking within their competition phase every Sunday or every Saturday or maybe twice a week. While on the other hand, an Olympic athlete will only need to peak every 4 years. Now, to help that Olympic athlete peak for his Olympics, or for players that are playing more regularly competition, then we need to make sure that our planning and our periodization of training is suited towards the needs of our athletes. So this is the real reason for why we do periodization, because again, it's been proven that planning training helps with peaking, and of course peaking helps with performance, which is what we're all after when we want to participate in competitive sport. You can have periodization for non-competition sport. However, this PowerPoints and this area of sport, exercise, health science is definitely related to the athlete. As you can see on the picture here, we have an annual plan. Now, an annual plan is normally 1 year in length, or it could actually be multiple annual years of multiple years for an Olympic athlete. So as an example, okay, the annual plan here for a football player could be a season, while for an Olympic athlete, you might actually have 2 annual plans. So this first annual plan that you can see here would be kind of the first 2 years, maybe before he goes to the World Championships, and then another annual plan will be put in place in years 3 and 4, gearing him up or her up for the Olympics. So there is a little bit of flexibility here with that. Now, most annual plans are known as a macro cycle, and we're going to cover those in a little bit. But most macro cycles are normally a year-to-year or season-to-season thing. Again, just reiterating, it's not unusual for an Olympic athlete to have 4 macro cycles because, of course, there's a 4-year gap between their competitions. You will notice that every periodization is then split from an annual plan into different, what we call phases of training. Now, this is a really important terminology for us to understand. So when you are asked, what phase of training are you in or you're aiming towards, you would need to be able to certainly identify that there are 3 different phases. There's a preparation or section. Then there's a competitive or competition phase, and then there's a transition phase. Now, transition is normally referring to your off season. So at the end of a particularly challenging competitive period, this is where you would have some rest, relaxation, and recharging going on. And again, each one of these sections is different in length, and we will cover those in more detail as we go through. Then you'll notice that actually each one of these phases is broken down into different sub-phases. So again, we've got our general preparation, our specific preparation as part of our general or our overall preparatory phase. So here within the general preparation, this is where you would do very functional all-round movements. This is where you would be focusing on the main elements of the sport and the demand, so the main components of fitness. So in other words, this is where you would kind of focus on maybe your strength and your speed if you was, for instance, a weightlifter. But then when you're doing more specific preparation, this is where maybe you would now start to look at something that is a lot more functional towards the movements that they're going to actually do in their sport, or components of fitness that are a little bit more challenging, like power, which is of course the combination of speed and strength. So you can see here this section is can be complicated, but you want to try and make sure that your focus is very much general fitness, and then of course tailoring it more towards the competition phase as you progress through this preparation phase. This happens all the time, this is kind of pre-season training and would happen naturally anyway, but you just want to make sure that you are progressing your program more specifically towards the needs of the athlete. Then when you're in the competition phase, of course, we have two phases here. We have the pre-competition phase. This is normally when you're, certainly in football and rugby and team sports, this is when you're playing your kind of pre-season games. You wouldn't necessarily go from not training, transition straight into pre-season games. There would be a relatively long period of time where they're doing some form of training behind the scenes, and then we're going into pre-season fixtures. Okay. Again, this is just developing more a competitive nature on top of what you're training, okay, leading you into, of course, your main competition phase. Now, again, like I've tried to answer over here, how does the periodization differ between rugby and a marathon and an Olympic 200-meter runners? The competition phase is really a main difference here. You'll notice that rugby players will play weekly, while marathon and Olympic 200-meter runners will only have their competition every so often. If they're part of like the Diamond League, which is like almost like the Premier League of athletes, then they'll of course train a lot more or have a lot more competition, but mainly they're there to peak when they're coming up to their Olympics every 4 years. So you can see that this length of competition will be quite short actually for a marathon and an Olympic runner compared to that of a rugby player. Very important in this period as well that if you are doing a team sport, that you don't have this kind of general preparation and pre-season type training to go alongside your competition. Please remember that people are going to be very tired. Players are going to be tired if they've just competed. So therefore then doing the high intensity, high volume training that we will discuss in the next video is probably not a great idea. So again, a lot of this is more kind of once you got to the competition phase, you've got to maintain your fitness levels rather than starting to progress them like the preparation phase does. And then lastly, you can see that the transition phase, this is the off season. This is the opportunity for individuals to recharge their batteries to go again for the following preparation phase. This season will normally last anywhere between 3 to 4 weeks. It does again depend upon your sport, but often we don't want them to have too long off. When you're at the the elite level, even their off season isn't really an off season. They will be doing training, long walks, runs, cycles, things of low intensity during this phase, but nothing that of anywhere near the kind of intensity or volume required to get them back up to a competitive nature. This is also, which is where it gets a little bit more confusing. A macro cycle here, okay, has been identified, and this is where some programs do different. I've put this one on for a reason. You can see a macro cycle can be a whole season plan. Okay, here, so this would technically be known as a macrocycle, or you could have a macrocycle that is looking at one particular sub-phase within yourself. So it does depend on how you use macrocycles. In our case, we're going to use macrocycles in terms of it being a whole year phase, and there's another picture that's going to describe it in a little bit more detail. So for this case, it can be a little bit confusing, but it's just different ways that coaches go about trying to plan their work, and I think that's the main thing here. Normally these ones would be called a mesocycle in our terminology. Okay, and we will cover that as we go forward. So these ones would actually be called mesocycles. Then the last one, microcycles. Microcycles are normally week long, okay, things that are going into it. So you can see here, if this was 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, you can see this would be a 4-week program that has a mesocycle dedicated to maybe one type of component of fitness within inside the preparation phase. So you can see it's almost a case of wanting to try and work backwards. So normally we would have, well, what's our competition date? And we would actually kind of work backwards in terms of our weeks. So that hopefully gives you an idea of what the periodization is. Following videos will again focus more on intensity and other aspects of periodization. So please click on the following videos.